Another one of our property tax reform bills that we'll be having this General Assembly, that remember is just one of the many targeted areas that we'll be getting at when it comes to the property tax system, is something called the Truth and Guarantee Tax that I just introduced recently. Now, I don't do this one very lightly because this will have a big impact on some areas and, frankly, some school districts. And that will be something to take into account, and certainly not finalized in terms of the current draft, but it will be meaningful for taxpayers and for transparency. So what it is remember, schools have something called a 20 mil or a 2% floor for their tax rate. So every school district is guaranteed to get at least 20 mils or 2% of the value for their district on their tax rate. And what happens is that over the years, remember, as your value goes up, tax rates go down because most of the levies that we vote on, most of the taxes that are assessed to us, actually bring in the same amount of revenue every year. And so as values go up, our tax rates go down. And so what happens is that oftentimes there are schools that will, their tax rate, if they don't pass new levies, will continue to decrease below that guaranteed tax rate amount. Now, the levies that count towards this are general fund levies. And that's important because as we pass general levies or as we pass traditional revenue levies, those count towards the guaranteed tax rate of 20 mils. And as those start to go below the 20 mils, well, what happens is that we have to apply the difference between what the actual voted amount is and what the guaranteed tax rate is. And that's where we've seen a lot of the tax increase over the past couple of years, the difference between what schools are supposed to be collecting in based on voted amounts, and then what schools are guaranteed to be collecting in, which is the 20 mil floor. Now, one of the aspects, though, that's important that most voters will not know, and this is why we're doing this bill and doing some of the work around it, is that not all levies actually count towards that 20 mil floor. There are other types of levies that can be assessed and voted on by the people, which they're approved then, but there are other types of levies which do not count towards the guaranteed tax rate of 20 mils for the school districts. And those most commonly are your emergency levies. And emergency levies are levies that are supposed to be passed with the idea that in 5 years there'll be a budget deficit or there's a large major catastrophe emergency at the school system. These don't count towards the 20 mil floor and towards the guaranteed tax rate. And so what happens is, in essence, you've got maybe your actual, what your tax rate should be, let's say are 15 mils. That's a difference between 15 and 5 with a 20 mil floor. So we assess 5 mils in addition to what you voted on every property in the school district. Well, now let's assume your emergency levy is maybe a 3 mil levy. And so with that 3 mil levy, which does not work with that marker, with that 3 mil levy, the school district is getting the guaranteed 20 mils worth of tax rate. They should only be getting, though, 15 mils worth of tax rate, but because they're below that guaranteed amount, we charge the difference onto every property with new values. So they're getting 20 mils. But because the emergency levy does not count towards that 20 mils, the voters have passed this, but they're getting an additional 3 mils in tax rate coming into the school, even though really their true effective rate, what they should be actually charging, is the general levies of 15 mils and the emergency levies of 3 mils. And so they should actually be charging 18. And so this is one of the things that has caused tax amounts to go up. And it's one of the things that certainly is not very transparent with the voters. The bill also does several other things too, including school district income tax, which does not count towards that guaranteed tax rate either. Now, bonds and permanent improvement do not count, and they will continue not to count because you have to bring in a certain amount of money, and that's a certain purpose in terms of new school building. And then there's something also, remember, we've always talked about inside millage, and that is something that is applied to every property. Schools get it as well. And what we've seen a lot of schools doing is moving some of their inside millage, complicated thing. All you have to know is essentially they redesignate part of their inside millage to permanent improvement, and that actually then gets removed from their general levies they're counting towards that 20 mil floor aspect. And so that will then actually increase their tax rate without a vote of the people and without necessarily actually changing anything except for just redesignating. So we would put all of these into that guaranteed tax rate. That way voters know that that guaranteed amount, if they've not voted on new levies, the school will still be receiving that guaranteed amount. They can still pass new levies, move themselves above this guaranteed amount. But the key here is knowing and having that transparency that whatever they are voting on is counting towards a guaranteed tax rate amount that the school district will be receiving anyway. Now, this is, again, not an easy bill in terms of just the idea of its impact. It will be significant in some areas, and in other areas, there won't be any notice of a difference. But in terms of our overall goal and strategy of decreasing and limiting the increases of unvoted taxes, making things more transparent and more straightforward for voters, and then giving direct help where it's needed most, this bill definitely qualifies under 2 of the 3 of those, and will be one of the ones that we're considering here in the General Assembly this year for property tax reform.